Alexander. I already knew that. However, seeing him made me feel unexplainable things. Today Alexander wore an all-gray, almost black, plaid button-down shirt with black pants. His expensive-looking silver watch was on display as he brought it up and glanced at it. He then looked up and I bit down on my tongue as I admired his beauty. I knew he was attractive. But some days it was too much to handle. His dark hair was messy and his hazel eyes looked at my blue ones. Victoria, he acknowledged. Alexander. Come sit, I said, nodding towards the sofa. Alexander walked over with his car keys in hand and took a seat opposite Quentin and I. Ironic how he chose the armchair and leaned back. We're all ears, Victoria, Quentin said after giving his boss and friend a nod of acknowledgement. Right. As you both know, before we get to Marcus, I need to go through with Caitlin and Max. Today's guy is Max, I started with, and Alexander nodded as he already knew of the current situation. How do you plan on doing that? Quentin asked. You see, today Williams Industries have a business meeting with the Sanders. Marcus is letting Max take it and dash. The Sanders? Alexander and Quentin both said at the same time as they looked at me in shock. The Sanders weren't really the grouping around type. And, I ignored, if Max gets the deal and the Sanders agree on the project of a new product, Max gets the role of head executive and dash. And you want to fuck it up, Quentin finished with a smirk. Meanwhile Alexander listened quietly, his gaze on mine. That's one way to put it, I shrugged. I then stood up and fixed up my red blouse as I circled the room, both Alexander's and Quentin's eyes following me. You see, I don't want him to have head executive, I went on. I want him to have nothing. I want Caitlin to have nothing and I want Marcus to have nothing, I rambled as I stopped circling the room and started at nothing but empty space. The men's chatter grew as they gave me disapproving looks. I simply strolled to the front and glanced over at all of them. My eyes found Mr. Sanders, whom were already looking at mine. I gave him a smile, silently asking for forgiveness, and he rolled his eyes. Mr. Sanders was still young for a businessman. 30, being older than Alexander and Marcus but young nevertheless. All right, you wild animals. Mr. Sanders shouted to his men around the conference table. Listen to the lady. I gave him a genuine smile. Many people could be just an aspect of my revenge. However, some were genuinely liked. Like Alexander? I thought silently and then shook my head. The men's chatter turned into a light mumble, then silence. I gave them another confident smile before I reached for the folder in front of me. Opening it, I kept my confident look displayed, however on the inside I nervous and confused. What the hell was this product even about? I remember Max mentioning a robot and its electronical advantages. So I decided to continue from there. Right. This mechanical device can help your business, this business and our business in many ways. I started off and glanced down at the text on the folder. The robot we have created is a significant form of source. A device so small yet helpful. I was plucking words out of my brain. I read Max's little notes and tried to turn it into a speech. An example would be your financial information and services at the company. Of course, we have other electronics to help with the server, however this robot is the new and improved source. What will it do? Mr. Sanders asked as his eyes stared directly into mine. Count, add, subtract, I said with a smile, multiply even. This is a new and faster way. I exclaimed. Why not get yours today? I added with a wink and the men in the room chuckled. Mr. Sanders glanced around to his men. I wanted to cut the presentation short. Short and simple always does the trick. If you do decide you like this product and want to do business together, we can sell this product to the many other companies, I explained and imagined cash wheels turning in Mr. Sanders' head. Mr. Sanders leaned back in his seat and rubbed his chin. He was listening and was all ears. We haven't named a price quite yet. However, with your help we can pick a digit and sell. With both our company names, who wouldn't buy it? I tried to persuade. If anything, I was helping out Marcus here. Giving him a fortune even. However, if this did work, I was on the inside and could make my way on top. Men, Mr. Sanders said, looking at them, we are done here. We can go now. The men didn't have to be told twice. Immediately they stood up and piled to the door ready to leave. Mr. Sanders stood up and I watched as he made his way over to me. Your name was? He asked. Victoria. Victoria Strikings, I replied, and Mr. Sanders nodded his head. I like you. I can do business with you, he said, and I smiled at him. That's great to hear. I'm certain Marcus will be thrilled. Dash. I pressed the lock button on my car keys twice, just to be safe. Men, women and teenagers of all ages hung around the area and I couldn't help but feel a little weary. I paused outside of my vehicle and glanced down at myself. It was just a bar, however I didn't plan on walking in there looking like I had just come out of a professional meeting. Even if I did. I unbuttoned the first 3 buttons of my red blouse and rolled my sleeves up. Pushing all my hair to the side, I held my purse tightly and made my way towards the entrance. It looked as cliché as it could get. Neon lights and littered cigarette butts. The J of the Joe sign hung loosely on a single nail. Now what was a rich man doing in such a poorly presented place? Walking inside, I was confronted by loud chatter and laughs. I glanced around the bar and it only took me a second to spot Alexander and Quentin. Both looked odd against the crowd as they wore expensive-looking clothing, meanwhile the others didn't look as charming. Their backs were faced towards me as I made my way to them. Quentin sat on the left and Alexander on the right. As I neared, I made a split decision and went right. "Hello boys," I said as I pulled out a stool beside Alexander and put my purse onto the bar's marble bench. "How'd it go?" was all Alexander said. I couldn't help but sarcastically think what an incredibly polite greeting that was. I shrugged and motioned the bartender towards me. "Max didn't get the position if that's what you mean." "But guess who did," I stated casually. "Don't you dare say Marcus," Quentin chimed in as he picked his glass up. "No," I replied, "I did." "What can I get you?" the bartender asked before Quentin could fit in a word. "What they're having," I shrugged and the bartender smiled with a nod and left. "Well, looks like it turned out even better. Head executive? That's a done deal, Victoria." Alexander grinned and I couldn't help but smile. Quentin smiled and nodded his head. "It is, isn't it? Say Victoria, I'm happy for you. Besides, what is this product? Surely this is an opportunity to sabotage Marcus?" Quentin desperately added. I furrowed my eyebrows then shrugged. "An electronical device. I'd say a calculator's more useful than the product itself," I said distastefully and Alexander's gave me a sideways glance as he grinned. "Oh? A calculator's more useful? I wonder what Mr. Sanders' reaction would be if he were to receive a simple calculator." Alexander chuckled as he sipped onto his drink. I smiled at that and glanced up. Quentin was already looking at me and then glanced down to Alexander. "Alexander, Victoria, the two of you won't mind if I leave, right? I've got a stack of papers to go through before tomorrow morning." Quentin stressed out and Alexander sighed. "Go ahead. I expect you at work by 7, Alexander warned, his dark eyes on Quentin. Quentin simply grinned and nodded. "Of course, boss." Sending me a wink, Quentin finished his drink and in seconds left the bar. However, before he did, he sent me a suggestive look and motioned towards Alexander. I was having a blissful time kissing Alexander until he slowed down the kiss and slowly pulled back. My lips tingled for a few seconds and I felt slightly dazed. He stared at my lips for a few more seconds before looking up at me with a sigh. "I should tell you too," Alexander said in his low voice and I furrowed my eyebrows. "Tell me what?" I asked and tilted my head. "It's only fair," Alexander said, ignoring me. I had no idea what he was talking about. But I really didn't want to know and I just wanted to kiss him. Was that too much to ask for? Apparently so. "About Rebecca," Alexander finally said and it clicked. I stared at him in shock for a second but quickly concealed it. How could I forget? He didn't know that I knew what had happened. He was drunk that night and when he was sober, he had forgotten the conversation. I saw struggle on Alexander's face and I couldn't help but frown and feel bad. I was making him remember the shady parts of the past and it made me feel guilty. "No," I jumped in. And shook my head as Alexander solemnly glanced at me. "I'd just tell him I knew and save the trouble. Save him the memories." I leaned in close and shook my head, looking into his dark eyes. "Don't say anything. I already know," I whispered and glanced down at his lips. Alexander didn't say anything for a second. However, he then roughly made me look at him and I held my breath. "You know," he repeated with squinted eyes. "How do you know?" he said harshly and I sighed. "Your trust in me is thrilling," I stated dryly. "That night I came to your place. You were drunk and well, you began talking." I shrugged it off. However, Alexander still looked mad. "And what? You didn't bother telling me?" Alexander said, sounding pissed off. As attractive as he looked even when he was angry, I concentrated on what he was saying. "It's not my fault you drank so much that you forgot, now is it?" I said, equally mad. His sudden change in mood was making me both angry and confused. "Why are you getting so angry anyway?" I asked as I angrily snatched his glass and drank from it, slamming it back down on the table. "It's not every day people know about my past." "About what happened?" he gritted and I sighed. "Yes. That's true. But you might want to calm down before I get angry as well," I said solidly and glanced up at Alexander. He didn't even flinch. Alexander wasn't easily intimidated or intimidated at all and that ticked me off sometimes. "Victoria, I think I should leave. My temper's rising and quite frankly, I don't think I can control it," he said. I didn't say anything and simply watched him clench his jaw and make a move to leave. I stood up and grabbed his hand before he could turn around. "Are you mad at me?" I asked with furrowed eyebrows. We had just shared a moment earlier and I didn't want him changing his mind. Alexander stared into my eyes for a few seconds before shaking his head. "No, not at you. I'm just mad. I'll see you tomorrow," he abruptly said. I felt unsatisfied and frowned. Alexander smirked and rolled his eyes. He leaned down and placed a kiss onto the side of my mouth. With that, he chucked $100 bill onto the bar's bench, near our drinks, and left. I was brutally grabbed by the arm and shoved into the front seat. I didn't bother struggling as the gun stayed steadily propped up against my head. No funny business, the bald man grunted as he slammed the door shut. I simply watched as he jogged around the front of the car and opened the driver's door to get in. After successfully placing his seat belt, the man put the car in gear and began to drive. Just seconds into the empty road, I glanced at the man who drove with one hand on the wheel and the other holding the gun pointed at me. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. The man ignored me and simply gave me a disgusted look as he looked back at the road. I sighed and glanced around the car. I looked down at the glove box and saw a picture of 3 infants giggling up towards the camera when the photo was taken. The picture was sticky tapped onto the black leather and next to it was a picture of a beautiful dark-skinned woman. I stared at the picture for a few more seconds before looking back up at the man. "Who are they?" I asked, gesturing towards the pictures. The man glanced down to where I was gesturing and immediately a flash of hurt displayed his features. A second later he sped the car up and clenched his jaw. "Let me guess, I'm used messing with him. Some people were just easy to read. Like an open book." "That one," I said slowly as I pointed to the dark-skinned woman, "was your wife." I continued and eyed him carefully. The man closed his eyes for a few seconds and reopened them, despite that he was driving. "And this," I began again, pointing to the 3 infants, "are your kids," I added and smiled at myself. However, I glanced down and then back up at him. This time I frowned. "However, your wife died. Didn't she? You have 3 children that you have to take care of," I said, feeling a little touched. I could be wrong, but words were coming out of my mouth making my frown deepen. "So why are you doing this? For money? To help your kids?" I asked curiously. "To pay for daycare? Food? To provide all by yourself?" Before I could react, the car slowed down and roughly came to a stop. The man placed the gun onto his lap and roughly grabbed my hair, pulling me towards him. "Who the hell are you?" he hissed. "Who'd you hire for a background information? Or better yet, who the hell did you kill to get it?" he said in a very angry voice. I calmly grabbed his wrist and yanked it away from my hair. Looking into the review mirror, I patted it down and then turned to face him. "I didn't hire anyone. Or did I kill anyone?" I said, gritting my teeth. The bald man squinted his eyes and tightly clutched the gun. "Is that so?" the man challenged. "How about what you did to Caitlin? You killed her parents. You stole her wealth. You ruined a family." He shouted as he started to shake in anger and my eyes grew wide. Did he just say what I think he just said? "Wait dash. You're a murderer." The man continued. "How could you bear to kill a family? Ruin one? I know how Caitlin feels. I couldn't get vengeance for my family, but I will get vengeance for hers," the man grumbled in a low tone, and I stared at him in shock. Without wasting another second, I advanced towards Caitlin. Straight away, Caitlin's foot kicked up off of the ground and swung around my head as I quickly ducked, dodging it, and kicked my leg out from underneath in an attempt to trip her. However, she jumped over just in time. Caitlin came onto me fast and held the knife as she swung it to swipe past my face. I leaned back and twisted around, kicking up off of my left foot and kicking her in the stomach. The blow was effective, considering Caitlin fell to the floor and groaned lightly. Before she could get back up, I pushed her back down like the man named Kevin had done to me earlier. "Caitlin," I rasped, "why did you have to do this?" I said in a fake disappointing tone as I shook my head. "I mean, we had a deal. A really good one. You stay out of my business and I stay out of yours," I said with a smile as I shrugged my shoulders. "It was easy as that." "Well, Samantha," Caitlin spat as she crawled backwards and then stood up, "I actually considered it. However, you taking those photos? All right, fine. Using my phobia against me? Maybe I deserved that, but messing with Max and his chance at that level of wealth?" Caitlin said in an angry voice. "See, that's when I decided I wanted you gone for sure." I simply smiled at Caitlin and then tilted my head. "What? Kill me? Like the 3 of you did to my parents?" I said, trying to get the words out of her. I was hoping Kevin stuck around. However, even if he did, Caitlin didn't say a word. I had to rile her up. "You 3 might have killed them so easily, but you can't get rid of me," I chuckled, and Caitlin narrowed her eyes. "Oh? And why not?" she asked. "You see, I'm not defenseless. And I'm not a cheater either. When you killed my innocent parents, they were defenseless. When you won their wealth, that was cheating. At life?" Caitlin rolled her eyes. "Don't be so dramatic. They died together, didn't they? And it's not my fault your mother was so weak." One slit against her throat and the women bled out instantly. "I don't recall creating such a serious wound." Caitlin shrugged, and throughout her words I tried to stay calm. "Weak?" I hissed, "my mother was not weak. But you know who is? The 3 of you. Killing people in defenseless states. Stealing even, I spat and looked at her in disgust. Caitlin looked at me for a few more seconds before giggling lightly to herself. Us weak? Samantha, do you not see the power we have gained by doing what we did? Caitlin laughed again and the noise set me off. I planned on having her put in jail, but this was the last straw. I suddenly lunged at Caitlin and tackled her to the floor. Straddling her, I grabbed her hand with the knife, trying to push it down as she tried to push it up. My other hand gripped her throat and I squeezed as I smirked at the glorious scene. Caitlin's free hand gripped my hand around her throat and tried to get mine off of it. Seeing that didn't work, Catelyn used her body to turn us to the side, making me let it go. I quickly stood up and so did she. You little bitch, Caitlin hissed, rubbing her throat. Who? I mused, me or you? Caitlin hissed under her breath and advanced forward again. She grabbed my hair and yanked it down. I couldn't help but shout. Not in pain, but in anger. I took in a sharp breath, as I averted gaze away from Alexander's curious and frowning ones. I wasn't sure if eyes could frown, but Alexander sure as hell made it look possible. I hadn't even realized Caitlin used my real name. But could you blame me? Both I was severely used to hearing. Can we not talk? I glanced around. Here? I said in an uncomfortable tone and I glanced at Caitlin's unconscious body. Alexander stared at me for a few seconds. He then looked at Caitlin, clenching his jaw before looking back at me. Fine. We both started making our way outside and I couldn't help but grimace. Both at the idea of trying to explain this to Alexander and because of the now filthy clothes that stuck to my body with dirt. Alexander opened his mouth to speak but I bet him to it, trying to stall the conversation we now had to have. Right. We'll talk tomorrow. We came with separate cars. I shrugged and didn't bother to think over what I had just said. Oh? Alexander questioned, peering around. You came here willingly? Got in your own car and drove here, he said in a serious tone, and that's when I closed my eyes for a second. Kevin had driven me here. My car was still at the bar. Exactly. I didn't. I have to catch a taxi to the bar perhaps, I dismissed and began walking the opposite way, however Alexander gripped my arm and pulled me back before I could get far. I'll drive you back to the bar, Alexander said as he pulled me close to his body, mouth near my ear. I didn't reply and simply stared at the ground with a clenched jaw, making my teeth hurt. Please, he whispered, I insist. I blew out a breath and looked at him with a grin. Sure. That would be great, I shrugged like I wasn't nervous about the upcoming conversation, even if I wholeheartedly was. Our feet crunched on the graveled surface as we walked towards Alexander's car. It wasn't his nice shiny red one, but a neat, black BMW. This man had money coming out of all his jacket pockets, I thought distastefully. Though, it's not like I could talk. Alexander, being the gentleman he sometimes is, opened the car door for me and watched me solemnly as I carefully slid in. The door was shut behind me and Alexander walked around the front of his car to get in. I rubbed my palms together and deeply inhaled the masculine scent in the car. So, Alexander huffed as he closed his door and started up the car. You have something to tell me, he hinted and didn't bother to look over at me and simply started to drive, eyes fixated onto the road. He tried to make it look casual, as if he weren't all that curious. But he most certainly was. Ida? I said in fake confusion and Alexander visibly sped up as the trees blurred past us. Victoria, he firmly stated and I rolled my eyes. Fine, I grumbled and stared out my window. Caitlin called me Samantha because, I paused and glanced at him. Well, because, that's my name, I simply shrugged and watched Alexander furrow his eyebrows as he frowned. I sighed and looked ahead, well my real name. I had trouble waking up the next morning. The blissful dreams of Alexander were way too comforting and the thought of having to go see Marcus dreaded me. Perhaps I could have skipped a day, or simply called in sick. However, Marcus had specifically dialed my phone leaving a message that referred to how he had missed me and wished to see me. With a sigh, I tossed out of bed and didn't bother doing it so gracefully. Nor did I bother fixing up the creases that crinkled out on the sheets or even fix up my duvet. Walking into my ensuite, I freshened up and tied my hair up in a high and tight ponytail. Today I wore a red, velvet materialized pencil skirt, with a black shirt tucked in, slipping on a long necklace with black, heeled boots. Grabbing one of my many handbags, I didn't stick around my apartment any longer as I rushed down the stairs to leave. Walking past the kitchen, I noticed a few dirty plates in the sink and I paused for a second. Later. I thought to myself and with a smirk walked out of the door, slamming it behind me. Some things could wait. Revenge couldn't. Walking out of the elevator, I descended towards the very familiar direction of Marcus' office. His door was surprisingly wide open and I took it as an open invitation. The halls were empty besides me, so I slowly walked towards the door and stepped in. Marcus? I said as I spotted him with his feet up on the desk and the phone to his ear. Marcus glanced at me and held up one finger silently telling me to give him a second. I gritted my teeth, but did so anyways. Caitlin, Marcus sighed, when you get this call me back. I need you here, and why the hell does this bank statement say $500,000 was pulled out of the company's budget? Marcus spoke into the receiver with an annoyed tone as he held a paper, examining it. I tilted my head at his words. Huh? Marcus let out a sigh and ended the call as he tossed his phone onto his desk. Getting up, Marcus fixed his tie and walked over to me with a smile. Victoria, isn't this a pleasure? He cooed and grabbed my waist as he pulled me towards him. Always is, I grinned and batted my eyelashes at him. I was getting rather good at role-playing, it amazed me. I tilted my head and put on a confused look as I looked at Marcus. What was that about? I asked, referring to the phone call. Marcus looked above my head and shrugged. Caitlin being Caitlin, he simply said with a grin, and I let out a small laugh. Marcus rolled his shoulders and rubbed his neck as he grunted. My phone's been going off non-stop. The invites were just handed out and everyone's in a hurry to dash. He was cut off by a loud shrill. Marcus' phone began to ring as soon as I opened my mouth to ask what invite he was talking about. You see? Marcus mused and smirked as he walked back over to the desk and picked up his phone. I tried my best to stay still. But truth be told, it wasn't that hard. My body automatically froze. However, I tried my best to kiss back and look willing. It felt wrong. All of this was simply wrong. I slowly pulled away and plastered on a small smile as I looked away with a bat of my eyelashes, trying to make it appear as if I was affected by the kiss. Oh Marcus, I sighed, and Marcus gave me a grin as he tightened his hold on my waist. You should go home. Rest and perhaps get your cheek taken care of, he said, and I frowned. But there's work that has to be done, I insisted. However, I truly wouldn't mind leaving. No. Go rest. There's a big party coming up and I need your pretty little face. Marcus smiled and I tilted my head. A party? Oh, I said in curiosity, and what party might this be? I asked, and Marcus' grin widened. It's more like a celebration, he explained, or well, an anniversary. Williams Industries, for years in making, to be more accurate. I looked away in thought when he said that. It was amazing how it had been already 4 years since he and the rest murdered my parents. Oh really? That sounds quite lovely, I said, and then inched a little closer. When exactly is this celebration? I asked. Even better. We've decided to have it on New Year's. A double celebration. Marcus smiled and I gave him one of mine in return. However, I was slightly startled by how quick the year had come to an end. However, because the year was coming to an end, it didn't mean the revenge was. I'll be there. I should get going now. You've got some things to sort out, I drawled out as I glanced around his now destroyed office. Marcus also glanced around and hissed in anger, suddenly remembering Mr. Sanders' refusal. Right, he grunted. With that, I turned around to leave. I was anxious to go and find Alexander and Quentin, to tell them of Marcus' reaction. Making my way out of the office and out of the building, I covered the small cut on my cheek by untying my hair. When I found my car, I opened the door and slid in. However, before I could start the car, my phone vibrated uncontrollably in my handbag, that was left on the passenger's seat. Unzipping the nude-colored handbag, I pulled out my phone and I was greeted by an unknown number. After a few seconds of uncertainty, I finally picked up and placed it on my ear. Yes? I said, and heard heavy breathing on the other line. Hello? Victoria? It's me, Kevin, a man said, and I frowned. You know? He trailed off, the one who wanted to kill you, he chuckled, and I grimaced. What a lovely memory, I said with a tight smile. Even if he couldn't see me, how did you get my number? I said, cutting to the chase. Kevin noticed and sighed on the other side of the line. Caitlin had to give me something to track you down with, Kevin said, and I leaned back in my seat, getting comfortable. Right. Anyway, Kevin said in a hurry, that's not the reason I called. I found something. And I took it, Kevin said, and I raised an eyebrow. The TV screen was completely blank for a few seconds. Then, female giggling was heard as a blurry figure appeared. Hands reached out to the camera and adjusted the lens, as the blurry figure finally came into focus. I held my breath as Caitlin appeared, swaying from left to right. It's on, Caitlin said with a wide smile as she moved back. Marcus and Max also came into view, both held beer bottles and laughed loudly. It was clear they were drunk. I also couldn't help but frown as they looked so different. 4 years ago different. My frown deepened as I eyed their clothing in the camera footage. Surely that wasn't what they were wearing when they murdered my parents. However, from my memory it sure as hell seemed like it. But then again, I could be wrong. It was, after all, 4 years ago. Caitlin, Max breathed out as he went up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. Caitlin, Marcus said in a firm voice, even if he was drunk, this is stupid. This better get deleted after, Marcus slurred. Caitlin faced her back to the men and looked at the camera with a little sly smile. Oh, don't worry, she giggled, it will. Caitlin then spun around, and picked up a tall glass from a nearby table. She went over to Marcus and Max with long strides. So, what are we celebrating too? She giggled as she raised her glass in the air. Max glanced at Marcus as Marcus glanced at him, each with large smirks. We, Max said with a pause, are celebrating to the upcoming wealth and power that we are going to gain. Max paused as he tapped his glassed beer bottle against Caitlin's cup. From this point on. Caitlin tilted her head with a small smile. For some reason, she didn't seem so drunk. What had she done? And how is that, Max? Caitlin questioned, gazing into her glass as Marcus downed his beer with a laugh. We actually murdered them, Marcus laughed in disbelief. And the gig at the bank the other week? Priceless, he laughed and Max joined in. However, Caitlin remained silent. This video must have been kept on purpose, perhaps a backup plan? I watched the screen as Max slowly stopped laughing and frowned in confusion, in his drunken state. Wait, won't someone know it was us who killed the Petersons? That we robbed them? Max scratched his head and Marcus rolled his eyes. My heartbeat picked up as I watched nervously. Max, we're all drunk yet just one of our brains seemed to be working, Marcus murmured. We planned it and went through with it. The Johnson twins are the believed criminals, and, Marcus pressed as he slammed his beer bottle onto the table, it stays like that. Marcus seemed to sober up as he sighed and grunted. Glancing around, his eyes paused on the camera and he then squinted his eyes. Caitlin. Marcus hissed at her, is that thing still on? Get rid of it now. Marcus scowled and Caitlin stood up with a tight smile. It's off, she shrugged. She then walked over to the camera. Her body came closer and in seconds the screen was back to absolute blackness. Today was the day. The day the social world and media will see the tape. The tape we claim as evidence. I was all ready and glamored up. It was past noon and I was ready to leave. I wore on my favorite dark red dress. It was long and reached the floor. The left side of the dress was designed to have a higher cut that showed of my leg. It was tight around the waist and then flowed freely. I tied my hair back into a long braid and completed my outfit with white heels. Facing the mirror, I gave myself a small smile. This was it. Before I knew it, I was ready to go. This was really happening. Quentin had texted me and kept me updated. The big projector was set. The celebration was outdoors so the fireworks would be seen when it hit New Year's. The projector was supposed to be a simple slideshow about the past 3 years of Williams Industries, but little did they know, it was more than that. Without wasting another second, I prepared to leave. My heart was pounding in my chest, both from excitement and nervousness. I walked steadily to the car, careful with my heels. Pressing the unlock button, I slipped into the driver's seat and prepared to leave. The place looked beautiful. The sun had already set, therefore it was dark and lanterns were tied up in trees, and tall tables were set around the grassed area with bottles of champagne and wine. A stage was set in front of all the tables with a microphone set up in the middle, with a massive projector displayed behind it. Many people hadn't arrived yet. There were just a few men and women in fancy clothing placing themselves at tables and pouring themselves tall glasses of wine. However, a full squad of paparazzi had already positioned themselves in front of the stage, all adjusting their cameras. I looked to my right to see several people beginning to arrive, so with a smile, I pushed my braid behind my back and began to walk over. Walking over to a vacant table, I stood by it and poured myself a glass of champagne. Sipping onto it, I savored the rich flavor. Feeling a light tap on my shoulder, I turned around with the glass to my lips and raised my eyes at Quentin. Isn't it a little early to be getting tipsy, Victoria? Quentin smirked as he grabbed the glass out of my grip and took a sip, placing it back down on the table. I rolled my eyes as he stood opposite from me, the table between us. I am not getting tipsy, Quentin, I mocked, and Quentin simply smiled. Since Quentin was here, then surely Alexander would be here as well? With that thought, I glanced around, searching for Alexander. Picking up my glass, I casually looked over my shoulder. Not seeing him anywhere, I looked back up at Quentin, who was already looking at me with a grin. He's not here yet, Quentin stated with a knowing smile. I narrowed my eyes at him and ignored what he said. Oh look, there's Marcus, I dismissed as I spotted him near Max. My gaze trailed to a dark-haired woman that was held against Max. I raised an eyebrow as I recognized it as Caitlin. And so is Caitlin, I said, tilting my head. Looking back over at Quentin, I gave him a nod. You don't know me, I don't know you, I said, and Quentin gave me a wink. After a few more seconds, the video adjusted, and the screen was crystal clear. It's on, Caitlin's voice said in the video. My gaze immediately trailed to Caitlin's, who stared at the screen with a fading smile. Marcus and Max, whom were looking at her, noticed the sudden change in expression, and followed her line of vision. Caitlin, Max said in the video as Marcus repeated. The crowd was confused. That much was obvious. Everyone glanced at each other in confusion, but watched nevertheless as the color from Caitlin's face drained. Caitlin, this is stupid. This better get deleted after. Hearing his voice, Marcus narrowed his eyes as he eyed the screen. That's when his mouth opened in shock. Realization spread across his face and suddenly he didn't look so confident. There's been a mistake, Marcus chuckled loudly as he tried to grab the crowd's attention with a nervous laugh, talking over the video. So what are we celebrating too? This time Max gave a reaction. He must have remembered where the conversation in the video was leading to as he grabbed Caitlin's arm and whispered furiously in her ear. Meanwhile, the crowd simply watched, curious. All still oblivious. We are celebrating to the upcoming wealth and power that we are going to gain from this point on. And how is that, Max? We actually murdered them. Someone get this off the screen. Now. Marcus barked in anger as he pushed people away trying to get to the stage. This is the best part, Alexander whispered into my ear and I grinned. My heart was beating wildly as I watched in anticipation. Wait, won't someone know it was us who killed the Petersons? That we robbed them? At this point the crowd gasped. Mouths fell open in shock and even a few of the paparazzis dropped their cameras. I said get this off. Marcus shouted furiously as he climbed onto the stage, searching for the power cord. Max and Caitlin stood frozen as the two shrinked into the crowd. But all eyes were going back and forth from them and the screen. We planned it and went through with it. The Johnson twins are the believed criminals. And it stays like that. Soon as that was said, Marcus successfully bent over and pulled out a cord. The screen went blank. However, the crowd and paparazzi had heard it all. They all broke out into whispers and stared at the man on stage in horror. You killed people? A woman in a fur coat called out, terrified, as she stumbled back. No. Marcus shouted as he shook his head furiously and walked closer to the crowd, as they all shuffled back. I said no. He growled in anger. I watched as the crowd's chatter grew louder. Then suddenly some began yelling. Cussing even. I watched security standing on each sides of the stage, glance at each other. They uneasily watched Marcus, and noticed how he was stirring up the crowd. Then without wasting another second, they sprung into action. One ran up the stage and before Marcus could make a move, grabbed his arms and pulled them behind his back. The next day I sat impatiently in the living room as I waited for information from Quentin. I held a mug of coffee in my palms and after taking a sip, slowly placed it on the glass coffee table in front of me. After last night, everyone fled the scene and left in hushed whispers and shocked looks. Witnessing one of the wealthiest men getting arrested wasn't something people saw every day. Getting home last night, I went through many media online to keep myself updated. However, no information on Marcus and the others were released. It was quite obvious a few people were getting paid good money to keep their lips sealed. After all, the less people that knew the less drama it would cause. Marcus would hate to have a bad name to his company. Or should I say, Caitlin's company. The thought itself made me grit my teeth. All these years, and I have yet to access my own wealth that was truly my parents'. Meanwhile I was waiting, Quentin decided to run a few errands to the police station and a few law firms. The paparazzi weren't any help as no one, even them, could seem to find any information on Marcus, Max's and Caitlin's questioning. However, I trusted Quentin had some tricks up his sleeve. That he'd be able to find the information we wanted. After all, he seemed to be a fairly convincing person. With that in mind, the door was suddenly pushed open and I shot up from my seat as Quentin stepped in, closing the door behind him, causing the keys hung behind it to rattle along with it. He had on a grim expression and I didn't like the look of it. Immediately I frowned. What? What is it? I asked in haste, walking up to Quentin who harshly took off his blazer and chucked it on the nearest leather sofa. It's worse than we thought, Quentin mumbled and I furrowed my eyebrows. It's worse? Nothing should have been worse to begin with, I gritted, walking back, as I slowly sat back down, Quentin doing the same. I was hoping everything would have ran smoothly. But of course with Caitlin not getting charged it was never smooth to begin with. Plus I knew it couldn't be that easy. Not with that level of wealth. So? I asked impatiently and Quentin ran a hand through his light hair. They're out, Quentin simply said with a sigh and I clenched my jaw. They're out? I repeated in a deadly tone. What do you mean they're out? I continued, my voice raising a little. Out of jail? You mean not arrested? I fired questions as my temper rose by the second. Quentin quickly raised his hands up in the air, in a gesture for me to both slow and calm down, before taking in a sharp intake of breath. Listen, he said firmly, they paid a lot, and I mean a lot of money for bail. Not only that, their lawyer said the evidence can't be considered as real evidence, Quentin said, then took a pause, considering they were drunk in the video. I looked at Quentin in shock. What? But drunk or not, they admitted to it. It shouldn't matter. It's not like they made up stuff whilst drunk, I tried to explain and Quentin shook his head. I know, Victoria. But they do have a point. Truth or not? Quentin said distastefully. However, Quentin pressed and I leaned in closer. My father had taught me to be nice first, because you can always be mean later, but once you've been mean to someone, they won't believe the nice anymore. So be nice, until it's time to stop being nice, and then destroy them. Laurel K. Hamilton. I blinked and then stared at the screen of my phone in what can be best described as shock. After a moment the screen went blank and I slowly stood up from my seat on the sofa. Oh no. I trailed off as I suddenly began to pace the room. This was certainly not good. Marcus knew of my identity and that changed everything. I wasn't afraid. Certainly not. That wasn't the case. It was that him knowing my identity decreased the chances of getting him back into jail. Marcus is going to be mad, Quentin mumbled, rubbing his chin, and my pacing slowed down as I came to a stop. I was certain I hadn't told Quentin about my identity. Hold on, I paused, and how exactly do you know? I asked with narrowed eyes. Quentin closed his mouth and turned to face Alexander. Alexander glanced at him, before looking up at my standing form. He heard it from me, Alexander said, his eyes staring directly into mine. I clenched my jaw and looked back at Quentin. It felt like everybody was now aware of my identity and I hated it. Not only that, Alexander didn't have the privilege to tell who he wanted. Quentin must have noticed my line of thought, as he sighed and also stood up. He didn't tell me straight out. He was mumbling some things and I overheard. Not to mention I sat him down and made him explain, Quentin said as he tried to defend his friend and boss. It isn't exactly something to sit and discuss, I replied distastefully. Well, Quentin added, we also talked about Alexander's, should I say, feelings. I raised an eyebrow at Quentin. What had that meant? Feelings? What about? I asked, curious, and this time Alexander stood up to join us. This is besides the point, Alexander stated calmly. He walked around the sofa and trailed his finger on the headrest. The question is, what now? Alexander asked, and Quentin and I became silent. I furrowed my eyebrows and with a few steps, slumped into the sofa once more. Before I could think of something, or before anyone could even discuss a suggestion, my phone chimed with a new text message and suddenly I clutched my phone in my palm even tighter. Who is it? Alexander said. It didn't come out like a question. More like a statement. Perhaps because we all suspected the same person. Marcus. Without wasting another second, I slowly turned my phone around. And like I had expected, Marcus' name was displayed on my phone's wide screen. It's Marcus, I deadpanned. Alexander and Quentin remained silent as I unlocked my screen to be greeted with a text message. I stayed dead silent as I read the text mentally. So? Quentin asked impatiently, what does it say? The lack of money is the root of all evil. Mark Twain. I stood frozen in my spot. Marcus softly chuckled as his knuckles slowly traced the nape of my neck. I must say, Marcus whispered from behind, I'm impressed. Clenching my jaw, I spun around and narrowed my eyes. Marcus raised an eyebrow at me and stared at me in amusement. Hello Marcus, I hissed. And right then, it was the first time I allowed myself to show him exactly what I felt. Rage, anger, and disgust. I allowed all the emotions to play out on my features. My glare was so intense Marcus took a step back. However, he then began to slowly circle around me. I didn't think I'd see you again. Samantha. I didn't like the way he said my name and I slowly turned to face him. Really? I hope you didn't think you'd get away with murdering my parents, I gritted, and it felt good to be able to show him my anger. However, what I didn't expect was for Marcus to throw his head back and laugh. Oh but Samantha, he cooed with a smirk, we already have gotten away with it. I tried my best to stay still as he fired his words at me. I was planning out my motives, however it seemed like Marcus had a lot to say. After circling me, Marcus paused in front of me. He took a step closer to me and his face was inches away from mine. He brought his hand up and placed his palm on my cheek. You know, he slowly drawled out, tilting his head, I liked Victoria a lot better than Samantha. I actually quite like the new you, Marcus finished in a bare whisper and I gave him a sarcastic smile. Marcus liking someone? I snorted and pulled away from his hand. So why did you call me? Planning on killing me like you did to my parents? I asked and clenched my fists. Marcus paused and glanced at the ground before looking back up at me in thought. I really did like you Victoria. I'm willing to let you live. For us to forget the past. I didn't dare let another emotion play across my features. Marcus seemed calm. Way too calm. Marcus, Caitlin hissed from behind, we are getting rid of her, she stated firmly as she glared over at me. That is not your call to make, Caitlin, Marcus said calmly as he continued to stare at me. I raised my hands and shoved Marcus away from my body. Actually, that isn't anyone's call to make, I chimed in and Caitlin narrowed her eyes at me. Glaring back at Caitlin, my gaze drifted to Max. He stood behind Caitlin with a frown. He didn't dare utter a word. Caitlin, I slyly grinned, have you told Max about your secret lover? Suddenly Caitlin's glare dropped and she looked at me with wide eyes. Standing up, she quickly spun around to face Max. Secret lover? Max repeated with frowned eyebrows. In moments of pain, we seek revenge. Vanessa Williams. Marcus grinned from ear to ear as he eyed all our expressions. I focused my gaze back to his as he pushed the gun to rest on my forehead. Everyone stayed silent. The only noises heard was everyone's ragged breathing. You're going to shoot me? I questioned with a raised eyebrow. Go ahead. I had to play this game carefully. If I knew one thing about Marcus, it was that he loved to play tricks and mind games. I knew he wouldn't shoot me just yet. But I also knew he wouldn't hesitate to do so. Oh, don't worry, Marcus said, tilting his head, I will. In that moment Alexander and Quentin were alarmed. It was obvious. However, I, on the other hand, didn't show any signs of emotion as I continued to stare Marcus down. Before anyone else could speak, there was light groaning and a little cry of pain. Not bothering to glance back, Marcus tilted his head further to spot who I assumed to be Caitlin, who was regaining consciousness. Aketla! Marcus cheered, his grip on the gun wobbling, making me eye it. Care to join the party? After a few long moments, I spotted Caitlin from the corner of my eye, slowly limping towards where both Marcus and Max stood. Her gaze suddenly fell on mine and her eyes widened in horror. You nearly killed me, she shouted out in disbelief, and Marcus let out a loud laugh, and I just stared at Caitlin now, silently. Marcus, she slowly drawled out. Shoot her, she suddenly said in anger and pain as she limped behind Max. She gripped onto her lover's arm for support and balance. However, Max furiously pushed her away and looked at her in disgust. In that moment, I planned to knock out the gun from Marcus' grip. Or perhaps, twist his arm and grab hold of the other end and point it to the ceiling. However, it wasn't possible. Marcus had pulled the safety pin and his finger was already on the trigger. I couldn't risk it. Don't touch me, Max said in hatred as he looked at Caitlin, the Lord knows what those hands have touched. Soon as the words left Max's mouth, Caitlin's mouth opened wide and she furiously shook her head. Mux. It's not true, I swear, she lied, relating to her secret lover, and I grinned, even if there was a gun pointed at my forehead. Really? I have photos, I offered, and Caitlin looked at me in horror once again. The tables had turned. And finally, she truly feared me. Enough of these petty issues, Marcus grumbled and Max glared towards him. You're right, Alexander suddenly said, creating even more tension. It is enough. So I suggest you put the gun away and fight like a real man, he hissed, and Marcus suddenly narrowed his eyes and grabbed my arm, pulling me closer. He rested and pushed the gun further into my head and slowly twisted it. Well, Mr. Celeste, Marcus sarcastically said, and I didn't dare move. Not yet. After numerous paperwork and questions, I was finally let out. I didn't get arrested. Stepping out of the police station slide doors, I inhaled a deep breath and sighed with my eyes closed. The wind blew widely and my hair flew behind me as I exhaled. It felt amazing. Miss Strikings, the lawyer whom I hired, said, clearing his throat as I slowly opened my eyes. The man was slightly taller than me and wore a navy-colored suit. He had short cropped hair and wore glasses that rested on the brim of his nose. Ah, Mr. Mert. You did an exceptional job, I praised, and the middle-aged man gave me a kind smile. Thank you. However, even though I did try my best, it was one of the guilty who claimed you didn't harm Miss Caitlin, my lawyer slowly explained, and I paused, staring at him. I tilted my head and awkwardly glanced around. What? Who? So they think I didn't even touch Caitlin? I asked, dumbfounded, and my lawyer nodded his head in confirmation. To be more exact, it was a man by the name of Maxwell. He even mumbled something about Miss Caitlin and not wanting her to have the satisfaction of seeing you in prison with her, Mr. Mert said, and I quickly leaned in closer. No one else heard that, right? I whispered, and Mr. Mert chuckled quietly. Of course not, Miss Strikings. Just me, he smiled, and I leaned back with a sigh of relief. It was good to know I wasn't going to get charged with anything. Plus, orange was definitely not my color. Well? What's happening with Marcus and the other two? I asked anxiously, and my lawyer softly shrugged. They're going up for court tomorrow. I can't confirm anything. However, I can guarantee you they will be put into prison, he said, and I remained quiet. I mean, even the police witnessed attempt murder, he said, explaining his point, and I gave him a small smile. You're right, I agreed, thank you. A lot. Your services are great. Taking this as a goodbye, my lawyer gave me one last smile and began walking down the steps. However, I quickly stopped him. But, I said, and Mr. Mert turned his head to face me. I want details, I said firmly, I want to know everything. What their charges are. Call me tomorrow, I demanded. With a nod, he continued his way down the stairs, and I simply stood in my spot for a few seconds. My head felt like it was going to explode and my body begged for sleep. However, I still needed to visit one last stop. The hospital. Without wasting another second, I jogged down the stairs and went in search of a taxi. Here. After handing the taxi driver a few notes, I immediately opened the car's door and jumped out. In a fast walk, I rushed towards the doors. Pushing it open, I ran inside and immediately headed towards the pearly white desk that was located in the middle of the large area. It had been 14 hours. It was once again night time and both Alexander and I didn't dare leave the hospital. I was a mess. I still had on my blood-stained clothes and dry tears were evident on my cheeks. My hair was a different story. It was beyond rescuing and I didn't have the strength to try and look presentable. Hearing footsteps approaching towards my seat outside of Quentin's room, I glanced up to see Alexander holding out a plastic cup towards me with steam coming out from the small opening on the lid. 6 sugars, he smiled and I couldn't help but grin. I reached out and grabbed the plastic cup, resting my palms on each side. Bringing it towards my mouth, I took a small sip of the coffee and closed my eyes for a second as the heat of the liquid lightly stung my tongue. Samantha, Alexander softly said as he took a seat beside me. I didn't fail to notice how he now referred to me as Samantha rather Victoria. Yes? I replied and glanced over at him through the strands of hair that covered the side of my face. Alexander held his cup in his right hand, and used the other to lean forward and push my hair behind my ear. His hand lingered on my cheek as he glanced down at my dirty top. You must be uncomfortable, he grimaced, go home. Get changed, have a shower, he softly said and I began to move away, ready to refuse but Alexander moved my head to stay focused on him. I looked him over and considered what he said. Meanwhile my questioning and before I arrived to the hospital, Alexander had already had his trip home and gotten cleaned up. Most importantly, Alexander said firmly, get some sleep. What about you? Aren't you tired? I tried to reason and Alexander grinned, holding up his coffee. I'm wide awake. Now go. If he wakes up I'll let you know immediately, he said and I sighed, standing up. Fine, I stated, but I'll be back. I know, Alexander smiled. Taking a few steps forward, I paused. Glancing at Quentin's closed door, I let out another sigh and continued walking. Samantha, Alexander called out and I turned around, raising an eyebrow. He pulled out something from his pocket and threw it in the air. Catching it, I glanced down at Alexander's car keys. Giving him a smile, I continued walking. I used the elevator to get back down to the first floor as I yawned numerous times. I was glad I didn't have to wait around for a taxi. After wandering around outside, and finally spotting Alexander's car, I rushed in and began the short drive to my apartment. I didn't take too long. It had simply been an hour or two, and I was out of the shower with damp hair and fresh clothes. I wore on a pair of leather jeans that was surprisingly comfortable, with a black tight skivvy tucked into it. Putting on my long gray coat, I ran a hand through my damp hair and grabbed my bag. Sleep could wait. Right now I had to be at the hospital. Just as I was preparing to leave, my phone began ringing, making me pause and then hurriedly searching through my bag. When the day of court came I decided not to go. My real identity as Samantha Peterson was going to be used and after all, what I did wasn't exactly legal, so I didn't want to risk it. For all the court knew, I was 2 different people. Instead, I arranged for my lawyer to be present in absence of Samantha, and Alexander and his lawyer was present for Victoria and Quentin. Quentin was slowly recovering in the hospital. It had been a few days and he would be let out any day now. Despite being worried about his condition, his question still stuck to me from the first night I visited him. Did he now call me Samantha or Victoria? Truth be told, I didn't know who I was now. Samantha was the old me. The scared, gullible little girl. Victoria was the vengeance-seeking me. The cold, unhappy girl. Who I wanted to be, I had no clue. However, I think I had a rough idea. After all, I was named Samantha at birth. Victoria was just a facade. I didn't have to be the same Samantha, of course not. But I would dispose of my identity as Victoria and honor the name my parents gave me. Before I could think too much about it, the familiar tone of my phone rang out loudly and I pulled it out of my back pocket. Seeing Alexander's name on the screen, I quickly swiped the screen and placed the phone against my ear. Is it over? I asked without a greeting. It is, Alexander's low voice replied. I sat in the passenger seat of Alexander's car and watched as he suddenly appeared out of the court building. He glanced around the cars and once it landed on his, he tugged onto his suit and walked down the stairs, meanwhile slipping his phone back into his pocket. Appearing near the driver's seat, he opened the door and swiftly slipped in. He didn't look at me and stared straight ahead. So? I asked anxiously, what happened? Alexander lightly tapped onto his steering wheel, and suddenly a grin spread across his face. He lowly chuckled and leaned back with a smug look. They weren't given the possibility of parole. Since the death penalty, unfortunately, wasn't in the picture, the court settled for lifetime in prison, Alexander explained, and suddenly a wide smile spread across my face. This was the day I had been waiting for. However, Maxwell has it differently, Alexander said slowly and my smile faltered. You wouldn't believe it, but there was a confession. Since Marcus was the one who shot Mr. Peterson, and Caitlin's blade was the cause of Mrs. Peterson's death and Maxwell was simply a part of the robbery, but in no way associated with the two deaths, he was granted 20 years in prison and 6 months of parole. After his explanation, I looked at him in disbelief. In no way associated with the two deaths? He was the one who had the gun. He pulled it out. I tried to reason and Alexander spoke in a calm voice. Your lawyer mentioned that. However, Maxwell didn't use any of the weapons. But Samantha, Alexander suddenly sighed. That's beside the point. The point is, they're in prison. They're out of our lives. No more revenge, no more fake identity. You can live your life how you want, where you want and with whom you want, Alexander explained as his head faced mine, his dark eyes peering into mine. Action is the foundational key to all success. Pablo Picasso. Mr. Sanders is ready to see the two of you. After dropping Quentin off at his apartment to rest, Alexander and I decided to see Mr. Sanders right away, both of us beyond curious to hear what he had to say. The blonde receptionist gave us a bright smile as she ushered us towards the office's door. Alexander stood up first, and softly grabbed my hand to pull me up. Placing his hand on the small of my back, he directed me towards the now open door. Walking in, I glanced around and eyed Mr. Sanders' office. I couldn't help but think how impressive and well organized it was. Mr. Sanders was facing away from us. He held a phone to his ear as he sighed. I'll call you back later, he said into the phone dismissively as he hung up and spun his chair around. Seeing us, he gave us a wide smile and stood up. Truth be told, it was probably the first time I saw him smile. I heard the great news. He cheered as he tugged off his suit's blazer. The last time I saw Mr. Sanders was during the meeting I hosted at Victoria. Since he was very generous towards me then, I gave him a smile. I then glanced at Alexander, whose eyes remained on Mr. Sanders. Great news? I repeated, and Mr. Sanders leaned on the edge of his glass desk. Why yes, he said, Mr. Williams and his second and third in line are in prison. Meaning his company is now. Mr. Sanders paused as he looked up to give us a grin. Well, mine. I opened my mouth to speak but stopped. I looked at Mr. Sanders in confusion as Alexander took a few steps forward, and helped himself to a seat. And how exactly is it yours? Alexander asked. Well, you see, Marcus signed a contract. In the terms and conditions, it clearly states that if the owner isn't in any position to run his company and the next two are also absent for the job, then the owner of their allied company has the right to own the company, Mr. Sanders explained thoroughly, and I slowly walked forward. Let us say the company is now indeed yours. Why does this require mine and Mr. Celeste's acknowledgement? I asked as I crossed my arms over my chest. Mr. Sanders smiled at my question. He stood up straight and made his way around his desk. Pulling open the top drawer, he began to search for something. I heard your tragic story, Miss Peterson. And I also heard that the Williams Industries was indeed made from your parents' money, he said as he glanced to look up at me. I clenched my jaw and softly shrugged my shoulders. You heard correctly, I confirmed, and I looked over to see Alexander watching me. Hearing shuffling of papers, I looked back at Mr. Sanders to see several papers in his hands as he closed the drawer. Walking back around, he walked towards me and paused in front of me. I never liked that man, Mr. Sanders said distastefully. I always knew there was something off about him. Offering the papers towards me, I looked down at them and slowly grabbed them, rotating the sheets around. I sat patiently at the desk and tapped my fingers onto the metal table. In front of me was a metal gate with small circles. An arm, and if not a hand, could only fit through the gap. I blew out a breath as I leaned back. I smoothed out the paper on the desk in front of me and slowly grinned. After several moments of waiting, the door on the opposite side of the gate began to open. Putting on a neutral face, I watched as a confused Caitlin walked in with a police officer holding her by the arm. He pulled out a key from his back pocket and unlocked her handcuffs. Caitlin immediately clasped her wrists and rubbed them in relief as the officer didn't utter anything and left the room, closing the door. At this point, Caitlin hadn't seen me yet. She was facing her back towards me and her body was frozen. I watched as she glanced around in confusion. Slowly turning around, I watched with a smug grin as her eyes slowly trailed towards me. When she spotted me, her eyes widened and her mouth fell open. I couldn't help but let out a loud laugh as I leaned forward and slapped my knee at her facial expression. No? Caitlin trailed off as she looked at me in horror. After a moment of staring, she spun around and latched on the doorknob. She hysterically tried to open the locked door but to no avail. Open this door right now, she yelled, get me out of here. Now. I couldn't help but smile widely. The sight was simply perfect. Caitlin, however, wasn't. I was used to seeing her with her makeup perfectly applied. Her hair was always in perfect curls or waves. Her clothes were usually neat and elegant. But her state right now wasn't the Caitlin I knew. Her makeup had been smeared off. She wore a prison place suit with dark stains. Her eyes had dark bags underneath them and her face had faint scratches from our last encounter. Her hair was no longer long. It was cropped short, just beneath her shoulders, tangled in knots. All in all, she looked horrid. If this was her during the first few days, I wondered how she'd go on for the rest of her life in prison. I didn't even have to speak. Caitlin backed away from the door and from the gate, shaking her head. No, she whispered to herself, I will not let her see me like this. She shook her head furiously and slid to the floor, her hands tangled in her hair. No? God no, she hissed quietly. I sighed and pushed my chair back. Grabbing the paper on the desk, I stood up and walked around the table, walking up to the gate. Leaning my forehead onto the metal, I peered at Caitlin who sat nailed on the floor. But Caitlin, I whined playfully, I really wanted you to see this. I pouted as I pulled the paper up to my chest and held it with both hands. I glanced down at it and smiled. Do you see that? I smiled. Remember that place you worked at? Well, I smirked, it was called Williams Industries. But now, look, my smirk widened as I pointed at a certain part on the sheet. It's now Peterson Industries, I said in a voice of fake shock. I watched as Caitlin slowly stood up and took a step closer to see the sheet. She looked at it in horror and didn't make a sound. All good things must come to an end. Steve Waugh. I sat in my leather seat with my eyes shut, a blissful smile on my face. My fingers lightly tapped on the armrest as I hummed a soft tune. Slowly opening my eyes, I peered out my office's window. I faced away from my glass desk and looked through the transparent windows that played the role of walls. There was a beautiful view of the city and I couldn't help but stare like I have been for the past few months. It had been months. I now owned my own company, Peterson's Industries. To carry on my parents' legacy, I also associated with the selling and purchasing of expensive, rare, and almost ancient jewelry. I also opened up a couple of stores named after my mother's maiden name in her honor. At first, it was a struggle. I had to pick up from where Marcus had so abruptly left off. However, with the help of Celeste and Sanders Industries, I was up on my own feet and in control. I hired many new workers that Marcus had fired previously over spite and for self-amusement. I was now a well-known businesswoman amongst the business world and it was great. I finally received the life I wanted and deserved. Throughout my plan of revenge and identity as Victoria, I never planned on meeting someone. Or even falling in love. But then I found Alexander. Just as a small smile formed across my face, I felt a soft peck against my cheek and I grinned, knowing very well who those lips belonged to. I turned around in my chair and looked up to see Alexander smiling down at me. He placed each of his hands on the arm rests on either side of me and tilted his head. His soft smile and quiet gaze had me amused. Mr. Celeste? I said in a fake formal voice, is there anything I could possibly help you with? He leaned down closer and smirked. Well, Miss Peterson, he said in a smug voice, there is one little thing. Trailing off, Alexander lowered his eyes towards my lips and he grinned as he placed his lips on mine. I was smiling from ear to ear as I wrapped my arms around his neck and pushed him closer. Before anything could get further than a kiss, I leaned back and gave Alexander a sweet smile. Was there anything you really needed? I asked in my neutral tone as Alexander stood up straight. No, he said dismissively. Did I need an excuse to come see you? He asked in somewhat disappointment and I rolled my eyes. I placed my hands on my knees and stood up with a smug look. I rewrapped my arms around Alexander's waist this time and he pulled me closer. Of course not, I batted my lashes and Alexander tried not to smile. Before we could get into further conversation, the door to my office was pushed open and my head snapped towards the door. Quentin came in with a large smile as he pulled his scarf off. My secretary looked alarmed as she tried to stop Quentin and Quentin gave the blonde an odd look. Samantha, Quentin said in distaste, get your secretary off of me. I stepped away from Alexander and couldn't help but laugh a little. If this story touched your heart, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with others who might need to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story. We'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more